Hey everyone, Chris Lopez here, and welcome back to another episode in actually, I should say, welcome to our first real episode in the Colorado Springs Real Estate Investing Podcast. So in this episode, Jenny Bayless is going to walk us through a very detailed comparison of some of her out-of-state investing compared to some of her Colorado Springs investing. So Jenny, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Chris?
Doing good. I'm really curious to see the data on here because years ago I looked at it. I've had this conversation hundreds of times with other people. So I'm curious to see what your numbers and what your data comes out to, especially since you're so numbers oriented. So jump into it and take it away.
Awesome. So the purpose of this presentation is I just really wanted to kind of deep dive more so for my own, I guess, personal reflection of, you often hear people saying, oh, I can't invest in Colorado, or, Colorado Springs is too expensive. I'm going to go out of state. And I actually, my investing journey in real estate actually did start out of state. So I thought it was kind of an interesting idea to take the actual performance of an out-of-state property and also a Colorado Springs property that had similar characteristics and compare them. So, for this particular example we're going to run through, one of them is a property from Indianapolis, which is a pretty popular Midwest cash flow market, and one is in Colorado Springs. They're both similar in the sense that they're, turnkey, rent ready, and we only held them for about 2 years and then sold them each. So I wanted to show through this example of why I transitioned from out-of-state investing to entirely in Colorado Springs. So my entire portfolio is now here. And, just caveat, this is a self-reflection. It's based on my personal experience. I realize it's only comparing two properties to each other, so it's not a perfect example, but just kind of wanted to chronicle, my thought process and why I pivoted my strategy.
And what market did you invest in out of state?
Yeah, so we actually had two out-of-state markets that we invested in, Indianapolis and Chicago, and we invested in those early 2016. This particular example is going to highlight my very first property, which I referenced on our intro podcast that I lost money on. so that'll be kind of fun to revisit that. It was my very first rental property that we had. And then just kind of give a slight timeline of my investment is that my very first Colorado Springs investment was in September of 2016. And then probably I had started accumulating a lot more Colorado Springs properties. And then about the middle of 2017, I started noting that my out-of-state properties actually had lower returns than the ones in Colorado Springs, which is kind of contrary to what, I thought was going to happen. And then by early 2018, we decided to sell our entire out-of-state portfolio and reinvest all the proceeds in Colorado Springs.
So if you bought two out-of-state properties in early 2016, and that was the route you wanted to go, why did you end up buying a place in the Springs in September 2016?
Well, I have to give credit to my husband on that. So he works down here, and he was down here for, a work meeting or something. And he said, I noticed that the properties here, they look like they'd be good rental properties. They're smaller single family homes, kind of where he was driving around. What are the numbers on those? And I said, oh, that's a good idea. So we kind of dug into it and I ran the numbers and I said, hey, this is pretty decent. Why don't we give it a shot? So that's really how we accidentally fell into investing down here.
All right, cool.
Yeah. So I think that it's important to kind of go over pro forma numbers. So I actually went back and dug up my old pro forma and put it in the spreadsheet that we use and for Indianapolis property number 1. So I bought this.
And Jenny, sorry to cut you off here, but explain to people what a pro forma number is and why you're highlighting this first.
Yeah, so basically what this is taking is its expected performance of a rental property. So, before we bought this property, we were given this pro forma, which I can go into later, but saying, this is what we expect the rental property performance to look like. And, after going through it, not really knowing anything, again, this was our very first rental property. We were like, oh, that's pretty good, so we can kind of go through some of the numbers that we guessed on that. And so bought this in March of 2016 as a single family home in Indianapolis. We were able to put 15% down, which is always appealing. We bought it for $73,400, very minimal acquisition costs. It rented for $850 a month, which exceeds the 1% rule that everyone talks about, which is 1%, meaning that the rent is 1% of the purchase price on a monthly basis.
So the purchase price was $73,000 and change, but your rents were $850 a month, so you're at 1+%
exactly
rent then for that rule of thumb. Okay.
Yep. So it
and just as
down.
Quick reminder, so that passed a very common rule, especially if people are out there in bigger pockets. You can't be on that website without seeing the 1% rule like all the time. And that's definitely a metric a lot of newer investors use. But as Jenny goes through these numbers, she's going to discuss them. It's a lot of numbers. Check the show notes, and we got all the screenshots of the spreadsheets on here as well.
Yeah. So just kind of going through some of the other factors. At the time that we bought it, the mortgage rate was 4.875, which, at that time we thought that was great for an investment property. Now it's pretty high as of the time that we're recording this. Vacancy factor, 8%, that's 1 month out of the year, which we'll get back to on that in comparison to Colorado Springs. But I think that's pretty typical across the US. Most people budget for about 8%. And then we also plugged in 0% for rent increase and appreciation. And the reason for that is just based on our research. We were always told, for cash flow markets, appreciation is icing on the cake. And that's kind of, what you hear a lot about. So just put in 0 for that to be safe. Property management, it was 9%, 13% reserves for monthly maintenance, no HOA, really cheap taxes, $230 a year, and then $600 a year for property insurance. So
were these numbers that you guys plugged in, or were these numbers from did you guys use a realtor, a turnkey company? Like, who'd you use to find this property? Actually, I'm asking you 2 questions. So who'd you use to find this property?
We used a turnkey company. So we were provided this information, which, I'll kind of go over on another slide, but one of my self-reflection points after this was, don't rely on other people's numbers. It's super, super important that you try your best to do your own research, but it's kind of a catch-22 because you don't know what you don't know. So it's a hard line to balance, especially when you're newer, but it comes with time and practice for sure.
As a total side note, this is what you just said there. This is a big reason why we like to have our clients do some of their own deal analyses, and then we will sit down and run through the numbers themselves. We really wanted people to educate and actually understand the numbers. And so what Jenny said, ourselves included, make sure you understand the markets, whether you're investing in the Springs market or wherever. Make sure you understand the numbers that we provide, and definitely do your own due diligence, because that's always critical. And we'll do our best to provide the most accurate numbers, the assumptions that we use. And we also want to teach you to analyze the properties as well.
So just kind of going on to the other aspects of the spreadsheet that we always use here. We're all in at $16,546, and we're seeing an expected cash on cash return of 14.2% and a cap rate of 8.6%, which that's unbelievable, right? Yeah. So we're like, hey, we don't know too much about investing, but this sounds pretty good to me. You always hear you want more than 10% cash on cash. So we were like, yeah, let's go ahead and get this one. So then just kind of skipping now to Colorado Springs. Again, this is not a property that we BRRRR'd. It was purchased rent ready off the MLS. Someone had flipped it previous to us buying it. And so we bought it for $155,000. And at that time, we were able to get a mortgage interest rate for 5%. And we budgeted $1,200 a month in rent. And then we plugged in the usual percentages that, you've seen Chris plug in his Denver real estate properties: 3% vacancy, annual rent increase of 3%, annual appreciation rate 5%. I did plug in property management of 10%, and then at 8% monthly reserves, no HOA, and then just $900 each for taxes and insurance. So kind of, sorry, go ahead.
I'm curious. So were these the assumptions you actually plugged in yourself a couple of years ago, or are you
Yes.
kind of updating now for the assumptions that you now use?
Nope, these were pretty similar to what we used in 2017 when we bought the property. So it's kind of funny how, we use the same percentages that you guys use.
Well, that's a good sign.
Yeah. So, just.
But wait, Jenny.
Yeah.
This does not meet the 1% rule.
No, it doesn't meet the 1% rule.
Why'd you do it?
Took a chance.
Right.
So we liked it. We liked the property, and I think further into the presentation, you guys will see that we made a pretty good decision on this one. So I think, it's good insight into the 1% rule isn't necessarily the end all be all when analyzing a property.
And something I think is important to highlight here is, you self-manage your properties in the Springs.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still budgeting for a 10% PM fee, but you can self-manage locally, but you had to hire a property manager in Indianapolis, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not flying out there every time, I need to collect rent or toilet's leaking. I'm certainly not going to do that.
So I like this because this is more of a apples comparison.
Mm-hmm. And then we also use 3% vacancy, which is pretty standard, which is quite a bit lower than, the out-of-state property. And we'll kind of go into how that in reality played out, I think. So for Colorado Springs, going all in, total cash investment, $34,520, and cash on cash return of 4.6%. And a cap rate of 6.2%, which I would consider just average. How about you?
Yeah. Getting a 6% cap rate, especially a couple of years ago, that's what we were seeing. That's very much like average investment property at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So neither one's a grand slam.
Exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to then go in and show everyone what my actuals were. So I'm a big proponent of paper profit versus actual profit and really understanding the difference between the two. We already talked about what the paper profit for the Indianapolis property was going to be.
Which is the same as a pro forma, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. And then going into, okay, how is this property actually performing? So for those of you that are listening, it's going to be a little hard to, visualize at this point. So you might want to check on the YouTube video, but basically I have the pro forma for year one and then actual year one in comparison again for year two. And then I have a total pro forma and total actual. So just to kind of hit some of the highlight points, my pro forma year one and my actual year one actually did better than the pro forma. So that was really, really good. We didn't have anything pop up for repairs and maintenance. Well, come into year two, the reason why we didn't have anything pop up for repairs and maintenance is because the tenants that were in the property, they pretty much destroyed the house. And I guess I just never felt the need to call, in year one until they moved out. And then that's when everything was a hot mess. So you'll kind of see that the reserves for repairs and maintenance is extremely high. It's almost $3,000 that we ended up having to spend. And then most importantly, we had super high vacancy rates. The property sat vacant for 3 months. And The reasons for that is because one, the tenants had messed up the property. So it took a while to get tradespeople in there to fix it up. And then they left in the middle of winter in Indianapolis, and no one wants to move in the middle of winter there. It's freezing cold. And then on top of that, we had to spend $1,100 in utilities because we had to keep the house warm because we didn't want the pipes to burst. So
What? 3 months was $1,100 for utilities?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you have like a sauna in there? I mean, that seems really expensive. Or is that just utilities in Indianapolis?
I'm guessing it's because the house is very inefficient is my best guess.
Okay. And speaking of that, like, when was this property built? Do you have any indication as like what type of class neighborhood, or can you compare it to any like neighborhoods in the Springs, just so we have some type of context? Or do you know?
Yeah, it was built in the it was built in the early 1900s. So, but in terms of neighborhood, it was just a typical, working class neighborhood. It seemed, totally fine. The particular tenants that we had in there, it was just a couple of friends that didn't take good care of the place. That's kind of what happened with that. If that kind of helps with context for that.
Yeah.
So we ended up having a negative cash flow of almost $3,000 for that year because of the vacancy and the high utility and high reserves, repair and maintenance costs. So if we took the combined total of holding this property for 2 years, we made a total of $413 in cash flow for 2 years.
And looking at these numbers, I would really recommend people, you guys want to dive into this. This is a great spreadsheet screenshot. Check the show notes. But looking at the total actual, so the 2 years of actual versus pro forma, what jumps out to me is your pro forma is about 20 grand in total rent. Your actual is about 15 grand in rent. And that was just, so that's more than 3 months of vacancy though. What else happened?
Well, I guess it's probably important to note that we sold it in October, I think, of year 2. So it is going to show 2 months less in that regard also.
Okay. So you had a couple months vacancy just while you were selling the property.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But did you actually hit those pro forma rent numbers of, was it 850?
Once we got someone in there, yes.
Okay.
So from, I guess it was like January through April, I think, when it sat vacant, it was $0, obviously. And then we got back up to the 850 again. Okay.
So rents are a difference there. I mean, your repairs and maintenance across the 2 years, not that much higher. Since your first year you had none, your second year you had some. In the longer, and they average out. Sometimes you're at 29 actual versus 2650 pro forma. Mm-hmm. So not a huge discrepancy there, but yeah, the utilities, ouch. Mm-hmm. That got you too, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I kind of lumped that in with vacancy, just being an absolute profit killer.
Yeah. Because I never, for us, I just round up property management and my vacancy numbers can account for, because, normally we don't have 3 or 4 months of vacancy. So, exactly. The $40 in utility cost for 2 weeks is nothing.
Exactly.
That's how my attitude out here in Denver is.
Same here. Okay. I mean, I think we've mentioned on previous podcasts that, my vacancy here is effectively about 0%. So, $10 in utilities for 1 day or whatever it is just not even going to concern me at all. So.
All right. Yeah. So annual cash flow of $413 combined for those 2 years.
Yes.
I'm assuming we'll go talk the Colorado Springs property next, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So then I just wanted to kind of, like I had mentioned previously, this is my very first property. I didn't know what I was doing. So I wanted to go back and kind of have retrospective thought on, where I made some errors. And I just wanted to highlight, I shouldn't have relied so heavily on numbers prepared by others. I should have performed my own analysis. You don't know what you don't know, especially if this is your very first rental property. So, I have to be kind to myself on this one, not beat myself up too much on it.
It's part of your education fee, right?
Exactly. That's how I see it too. So then going into Colorado Springs. So, just to kind of go, side by side again, we have the pro forma and actuals for year one and year two, and then we have the total pro forma and total actuals. So going in, I bought this, I think it was March of 2017. So just about a year after the Indy property. And if we kind of scroll down for year one, annual cash flow, between pro forma and actual, I'm up about $300 from pro forma. So I performed $300 better than what I was budgeting for. And then the same thing, the next year, I was up about $100 better than what I was budgeting for. So all in all, my total pro forma was $3,473, and my total actual cash flow for the 2 years was $3,862. So I actually came out about $400 ahead of what I was budgeting for, which I thought was interesting how close I came to my actual pro forma numbers on this one.
Can I ask a few detailed questions on here?
Sure.
Because one thing that's very interesting to me on here is that, in your performance, you have the 10% PM fee.
Mm-hmm.
Your actuals, you have none since you were self-managing.
Mm-hmm.
But for both years as well, your repairs and maintenance were higher than you had performed.
Yep.
So what happened with the repairs and maintenance on this? Because your pro forma was around 1,200 year one, your actual was like 2,800, and similar numbers for year two. So what's the story there?
Great question. So that was kind of my retrospective on this particular property, is that I should have used higher CapEx and maintenance. The property was previously flipped, but being new to investing, I didn't really pay attention to things that I should have been paying attention to when we walked the property. So there's a lot of stuff that when you turn it into a rental property, it's really important to take note of. So for instance, the fence was in disrepair. So we had to basically fix the fence because, we were renting to people with dogs, and that's a really important thing that I do down here is rent to people with pets because it gets more people in the door. So, that was really important. We needed to make sure that the dogs were safe and everything. So we had to fix the fence. The washer and dryer that were installed originally were probably, off the truck type of washer and dryer. They didn't last too long. So we had to replace that. So it's just kind of, me still being really new to the process and needing to kind of hone in on what is important for maintaining a rental property. So this is extremely high repairs and maintenance for this particular one.
Okay. Now I want to just really kind of give a different perspective on here, because going at the combined 2 years for this, you had about 3,500 pro forma for annual cash flow and about 3,850 for your total.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you had actually hired a property manager at 10%, which actually probably been a little bit lower since you've got some of your vacancy and turn cost in the other areas, but say that was, $2,500 or so in actual PM fees, your cash flow would have been about $2,000 low, or I guess $2,500 lower than your actual numbers are.
Yep.
Again, just want to really highlight, because everything in my mind is just pros and cons.
Yeah.
Our goal here is to provide you data, poke holes in it and help you guys make the right decision. Jenny and I are both big fans of investing in our backyards. So if you actually hired a property manager, your cash flow would have been lower.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, a reality. But since this is in your backyard, you're able to self-manage and therefore create better cash flow, right?
Exactly. And kind of if you look line by line, the complete difference is right on that repair and maintenance line.
Sorry, say that again.
So if you look line by line on the pro forma and actuals, the majority of the difference is that repairs and maintenance line item. Just totally missed the ball on that one.
Oh yeah, the actual was about $6,000. The total was about 2,400.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And so this is again, they said learning experience, but also the fact that you're able to self-manage. those two things helped you still have a positive cash flow.
Exactly.
And
kind
from
of
the
saved
managing
myself.
standpoint, I mean, how much more time did this take, or how much time did it take you to manage your out-of-state property manager versus you self-managing this rental? Because either way, you're still having to put time in to manage your tenant or manage your property manager.
Exactly. So, I mean, I would say it's very comparable. So, you know, we have really, even on this one, which is our second property, I believe, in Colorado Springs, we kind of figured out a process. You know, we use Cozy to collect rents. We outsource all of our repairs and maintenance. We are not handy people, so we outsource them to people that are good at that. So it's really just taking phone calls and organizing and coordinating things. Whereas same thing was happening in Indy. You know, we're calling saying, hey, why is there no one in this property? Like, what is going on? Why, you know, when are they going to fix, you know, the damage that the previous tenants did? So in terms of headache, Colorado Springs was significantly less because it was just normal business. Like nothing out of the ordinary happened. Stuff breaks, you know, no one's fault, fix it and move on with life. But, you know, the out of state, I felt kind of helpless a little bit because I couldn't really do anything. So it was more stressful to me.
And the last thing I want to point out to our listeners here is I'm kind of just keep scanning your data on here, Jenny, is that your total utilities for those 2 years is $42. So
Yeah.
42.00 versus 1100. And so is that that's in year one. So is that like the first couple of weeks you bought it and Excel's in your name, or not Excel, but whatever you guys use down in the Springs?
Yep. CSU. Exactly. You got it complete. You know, we bought the house, then we marketed it for rent. And I think it took a couple days to get it filled and turned over.
Awesome.
Yeah. So then I think it's also important to kind of go in and look at it holistically. So I know Chris always mentions on his podcast about the return on investment quadrant. And I really like that because it's really a tool to show you, okay, cash flow isn't everything, which I know he's talked about a lot. There's other aspects to return. So just kind of going into that, as I mentioned, we held both properties for about 2 years and sold both of them about after 2 years. So just kind of going through everything I have on the spreadsheet for those of you listening, purchase price, sales price, selling costs, net sales proceeds, and then of course the capitalized purchase and buying costs. So just taking the difference between those two figures, the appreciation return for Indianapolis was about a negative $5,000, meaning we lost about $5,000 between the sale and purchase of the property.
And is that including your sales costs in there? Because I see the purchase price in Indy at $73,400, your sales is $75,500, but you're taking the sales cost to the transaction cost and the appreciation number.
Exactly.
Okay. And how'd you sell for so cheap for $2,500 out there? That seems very low for transaction. And
it is. Yeah. Our PM helped us. They knew that we were not super thrilled about this property. So they did us a big favor and, sold it for very low transaction for us.
Okay. So you got that. Now what about the Springs property? Just comparing, let's compare these four ways you make money in real estate, Indy versus Springs, line by line, because this is really interesting to me.
Sure. Do you want me to go over the sales data first?
Yes.
Okay. So for purchase price, Indianapolis was $73,400, Colorado Springs, $154,900. So it was almost double. Actually, it was more than double. So then if we're going to sales price for Indianapolis, I sold it for $75,500. Colorado Springs, we sold it for $204,500. Selling cost for Indy, $2,555. Colorado Springs was $10,814. And then
now,
the net.
Sorry, before you jump on the next line, for the Colorado Springs, did you sell this once you're an agent, or is this still before you're an agent?
Nope, I had another agent sell it for me.
Okay, so you had all the normal, just full selling cost. Okay.
Exactly. Net sales proceeds for Indy was $72,945. And then the net sales proceeds for Colorado Springs was $193,685.50. And then I went back and looked at the capitalized purchase and buying costs because I wanted to see, when we bought the thing, how much we spent on loan costs, title costs, all that good stuff. So looking at Indy, it was $77,938, and Colorado Springs was $158,440. So taking the difference between that and the net sales proceeds, Indy, we have a negative $4,993. And then for Colorado Springs, we're up $35,245.
So obviously some big difference here because looking at the percent returns on here. So Indy's a negative $5,000. So that's a negative 30% return. Springs was basically a $35,000 positive net, or just over 100% return on your money.
Exactly.
So I'm curious too, because obviously the Front Range, we are in an appreciating time right now where the numbers appreciate. What do you say when people say, well, you can't bank on appreciation? Like, what would be your response there? And what was your thinking at the time while you're going through this as well? Because that's a very common, debate that all investors have, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's a very valid point to make. I would agree. You cannot bank on appreciation. Going into it, we didn't bank on appreciation. I think, however, for Front Range markets, it's very reasonable to expect moderate appreciation, just due to the economy, really. I mean, there's people constantly moving in here. Demand is high. Supply can't keep up with the demand of people wanting to buy and rent homes here. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expect something moderate.
All right. Let's talk about cash flow now.
Sure. So cash flow, as we mentioned for Indy, $413 for 2 years. So about 3% return on my initial investment of $16,500. For Colorado Springs, it was $3,862, which is about 11% on my initial investment of $34,500.
All right. So they're both positive there. So that's good. And before we move on to debt pay down and appreciation, those are going to be, much more static.
Yep.
Do you have any idea, since you sold this 2 or 3 years ago, just the what if, hey, if you had kept it, do you know what the price would be now, or have rents increased by chance?
I do. So I have a property that's right down the road from this one, and it's now worth $230,000, and I'm renting it for $1,300 a month.
Say the rent again.
$1,300 a month.
Okay. What about the Indy property? You have kind of any idea on that by chance?
No, I haven't looked into it. I just kind of left that in the past. But
leave that in the closet.
Yep. I'm not sure.
Okay. If you ever get bored, I'd be curious to know. Because I hear a lot of times, just, whenever talked to someone the other day, her mom was moving from not Indianapolis, but a Midwest market from Denver. And she's owned her house there for, I want to say 10 years. And she's going to lose a few dollars on them because there's been literally 0% appreciation.
Wow.
Because guys, once you pay the transaction cost, which real estate, you always pay transaction cost, then she's going to lose a few dollars, which just, it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, it is. It's a different concept than what we're used to here, for sure.
Yeah, I'd be curious if the cash flow, if that offset it, but that's always hard to tell. All right, so getting on to debt pay down and depreciation. Let's talk about those and compare those, Indy versus Springs.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the interest rates that we had for Indy and Colorado Springs are pretty similar. 4.875 for Indy, 5% for Colorado Springs, both resulting in 9% debt pay down over 2 years. That makes sense to me. Obviously, numerically, Colorado Springs looks like it's doubled, but it's the same percentage. It's just a larger asset,
Yep.
more leveraged. And then depreciation, pretty similar as well, about $1,500 for Indy, and then $2,240 for Colorado Springs. Indy is a little bit higher just because their land allocation is lower. So that's the discrepancy there between Indy and Colorado Springs.
Now, what about your total return?
So if we add up everything between the two markets, I'm at a total negative $1,654 for Indy and a positive $44,445 for Colorado Springs.
Wow.
Yeah.
And something that's interesting to me looking at the Indy numbers here, and if you guys want to see this is all going to be in the blog post. The biggest dollar amount you have in your return is at just under $1,500 for depreciation, then just under $1,430 for debt pay down, then the cash flow. So your biggest returns when Indy was actually depreciation and debt pay down, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, especially since depreciation is a non-cash attribute. So it's, not all
Did
that
you actually
exciting.
get to realize that benefit since you were able to write that off? Actually, since you're a
Well,
CPA,
no, I still had to pay recapture on it.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. So
obviously this one was not worth 1031ing.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just, we kind of licked our wounds and moved on. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. This is great data, Jenny.
Thanks. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of sum up, again, this is my personal opinion and kind of why we shifted our strategy, but just kind of highlighting the fact that vacancy absolutely kills cash flow. It is so important. And I didn't really ever take into account that that's like probably one of the most important, things to keep an eye on your property. And just kind of highlighting the fact that the Colorado Springs property had basically 0%. I mean, it was a few days vacant between when we first bought it and first got it rented out over the 2 years, whereas the Indy property was vacant for 3 months in less than 2 years. And I believe that this is due to the demand of rentals and lack of supply of reasonably priced rental properties in Colorado Springs, and probably vice versa elsewhere. I don't know specifically, but I would have to imagine that there's probably more rental properties in some of the cash flow markets as there are compared to here. So it kind of gives everyone who does choose to invest in Colorado Springs a bit of a leg up, because it's more of a rare find to get a rental property compared elsewhere.
And I think this is another thing, because I agree with you, the whole vacancy thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something, I don't hear people discussing when they're, debating out of state versus investing in their backyard, especially here in in our markets, is that, Denver is, it's a tighter, the Springs and Denver are tighter cash flow markets, but there's just that big demand there because people are moving here. People need rental properties. There's just huge demand for it, which is great as a landlord.
Exactly. Yeah, it's more valuable than until you're in it, I think.
Yeah.
So then I kind of gained some personal introspective, value from it also. I realized how much of a control freak I am after this. So, being able to be close to the property, and at the time that we had bought this, we were living up in Parker, so it's still about an hour away. And even though I outsourced the majority of the work, there was just this sense of control that I had, that if something happened, I could drive down there and look at it. And for some reason, that just helped me sleep better at night. And, this is totally just a personality trait of my own. So it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone else, but just kind of how I operate and function.
And that's something I agree with, because that was something years ago when I looked at out-of-state investing. That was something I realized. And also, to take it one step further, generally speaking, I'm an optimist in life, but when it comes to investments and business and just day-to-day things, I always think it's a matter of when not if something goes bad. It's a matter of when just something goes sideways on you. And it's much easier to be able, I think, handle something local versus an airplane right away. And that was one of my biggest deterrents.
I agree. And then something else that I've kind of, focused on was that I believe a strong economy equals strong performance when it comes to rental properties. So because Colorado Springs has a stronger economy, it helped more significantly with the total return. So not only did, my vacancy rate drop, but my appreciation return also increased. So even if we take all that out, my cash on cash return was still better than the property that was in the, a traditional cash flow market. So I think that's just kind of important to highlight.
No, I think it is. So I'm curious because I've actually never invested out of state, like you have. I did, have an out-of-state investment property, but that was a property I actually lived in. I basically house hacked and nomaded it in Nevada about a decade ago, lived there, then moved away. But what I've told people as I have this discussion on a very regular basis is that, and I really want to hear your opinion on here, is that, investing, it's all pros and cons, whether investing here or investing out of state, all pros and cons.
Yep.
But I feel like I said my two biggest things from looking at it myself and talking to a lot of people that have done it successfully, and also a lot of people that have kind of gone your route where, hey, we owned it, not for us, and then brought the money back locally. The two things I recommend now is, like, if you have some type of competitive advantage in an out-of-state marketplace, I think it makes sense to look at there. Like, you grew up there, or you still have family or a very trusted person there that can basically be your trusted boots on the ground, whether they're in real estate or a contractor or just your brother or family that you entrust to help be that, like, eyes on the ground to make sure it works. I think that is a potential reason to look out, or, to out-of-state invest. But the other thing is the people I know that have done very well investing out of state, a lot of them lived on an airplane for a year or two. I might be exaggerating there a lot, but they spent a lot of time flying back and forth. And the first year or two, a lot of them, they had very negative returns until they got the areas and property management dialed in. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you're willing to, if you have that competitive advantage, you're willing to put that time out there, it can make a lot of sense. If you can't, I'm a big fan of investing locally. But so what advice do you give people in terms of just, pros and cons? And I always try to attach myself. Obviously, I'm biased towards Denver. I think you're biased towards the Springs. What type of, like, pros and cons would you tell people?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. If you do have a competitive advantage, exploit it for sure. I think that will, make things a lot easier for you in the long run, and potentially, allow you to have a better return on that other market than here for sure. But otherwise, I mean, I think that it's just really, really important to do as much research as you can. We thought we had a good grasp of it, but it's just easier when you can just drive to the neighborhood and look around and just kind of hang out at the house for a while. I think that you're able to kind of consume, data a lot better that way when you're able to just kind of be there in person. And that could just be me, but I think that's something to consider as well.
Great. Well, Jenny, this has been a great presentation on your part, great data. So thank you for putting this together. I know how tedious it is when you gather the data. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'm sure the listeners do as well.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap up this podcast. If you guys have questions on investing in the Springs market or want to dive more into data, reach out to Jenny. Her contact details on the website, or email her at jenny@envisionrea.com. Thanks, everyone.